All right. Hi, everybody. This is E-Block, the student panel. So we're going to introduce ourselves as officers. So I'll pass on the mic.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Wayne. I'm an officer of AACC and I'm a junior.
All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie, and I'm a senior, and I'm a co-president of AACC. So in this block, we have 10 students here who will share their experiences with us as an AAPI student in Newton Public Schools. And please introduce yourself and share how you identify in terms of race, ethnicity, and pronouns, and why.
Hi, I'm Zizi Saeed. I'm a sophomore and I use she, her pronouns and I identify as Indian.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm a senior. I use she, her pronouns, and I identify as Chinese American and Asian American.
I'm Maya. I'm a junior. I use she, her pronouns, and I identify as mixed race, but I'm half Indian.
Hi, I'm Tia. I use she, her pronouns, and I identify as Indian American.
Hi, I'm Eureka. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a senior and I identify as Japanese American and AAPI.
Hi, my name is Sean. I'm a junior. I use she, her pronouns, and I identify as Korean American.
Hi, my name is Luke, and I'm a senior. I use he, they pronouns, and I identify as Armenian American and West Asian.
Hi, I'm Juliana. I'm a senior. I use she, her pronouns, and I identify as Chinese American.
Hi, I'm Rose. I'm a senior. I use she, they pronouns. I'm mixed race, but I also identify as Chinese American and Asian American.
Hello, my name is Rialto Hanairo. I'm a senior. I identify with he, him pronouns, and I am Filipino American.
Sorry. All right, here. Okay. So I'll present some questions to you, and then each of you will participate to answer. So the first question is, what does being Asian American mean to you? And how has it shaped your identity?
I can go first. Okay. I think it means trying to get a balance of like enjoying your culture, your Asian heritage, while also kind of trying not to seem like a perpetual foreigner or not American enough. And I think a lot of the times it's really hard to find a balance between those two.
I think adding on to that, I think North does a really good job of like having all these different affinity groups where you can like have a safe space to not feel like pressure to be more American or more Asian. So I think that definitely helps with like that balance that you're talking about.
And then I think for like the second half of the question, for how it shaped my identity, I am mixed race, so my mom's side of the family is Indian, and they're the people who I was surrounded by the most growing up. So like that was the half that I definitely identified with more. And like until middle school, I really only considered myself to be Indian. So in that sense, like the culture and the traditions, those were the kinds of things that kind of like shaped my racial identity as I was growing up.
I think for me personally, I'm an adoptee from China, so I've always been very culturally American. So as I was younger, I think being Asian American to me was a lot more about like how I looked rather than what food I ate or what languages I spoke.
And I think for me, since I'm from a part of Asia that isn't as well represented within the Asian American or AAPI umbrella, I think when I was younger, I never really like assimilated to the umbrella term of Asian American until fairly recently. So I think like being Asian American, especially recently, has been more of like a journey and like kind of like finding who I am and like kind of the terms that I like kind of identify with, as well as just like looking back at my past experiences and kind of evaluating and like self-reflecting on those experiences.
Yeah, I think for me, my journey developing my ethnic identity as someone who's Japanese American and developing my racial identity as someone who's Asian American have been intertwined but also slightly different in a sense, where I feel like I identified a lot more quickly and easily to being Japanese American, and it's only been in the past few years or so that I've really like fully developed my identity as someone who's AAPI, in the sense that I've always known that I'm Asian, like identified as Asian, but understanding like what that means within the larger context of the AAPI community and how my identity influences my experiences has been more of a recent development, I would say.
Yeah, for me, what's really important to note about the word Asian American is it has this political sort of root. It was created to unify AAPI Asian groups because it's a huge continent with many diverse cultures. So part of that identity, part of identifying as Asian American is unifying for political action, whether that's for AAPI individuals or other BIPOC individuals or other marginalized groups. So a big part of my owning the term Asian American has been working with other groups of BIPOC individuals and other marginalized groups to sort of create change.
For me, I think being Asian American has been a lot of trying to, I guess, balance the two aspects of my identity. And I think it's been more of a struggle to just kind of intertwine the two, because I know definitely, especially throughout middle school, I really wanted to assimilate more to American culture, and that kind of involved leaving behind some of the aspects of my Chinese identity. And I think because of American culture and those ideals that kind of were pushed like in my culture and my family, it's just kind of been a struggle to figure out how the two fit together, because definitely I think my parents identify more as Chinese rather than Chinese American, and for me it's kind of been discovering how being American also fits into my identity as well as my cultural heritage.
I think for me, there have been multiple facets that have shaped my growth, and one from experiences, two from reflections, and then three pulling out that why and that understanding that I have and how I arrived there. And I think when you put those three together through a lot of introspection, especially over COVID, I was able to find a lot of pride and being able to embrace who I am from both my European roots and my Asian roots and my American roots together, but also keep the nuances that make each part great and just kind of unify them into one beautiful, I guess, tapestry that is me.
Awesome answers. Have you had any like lunchbox moments or times where you made to feel ashamed of being Asian American?
For me, I've definitely had a lot. I think at the beginning of middle school, like especially when I was like with new people who I hadn't gone to elementary school with, a lot of them didn't know that I was Indian. So like if I ever brought like Indian food for lunch, it would be like this thing that would bring a lot of unwanted attention upon me, because they'd be like, "Oh, you're Indian," and then they'd be like, "Oh, what's that?" And then like things like that. And so then I kind of steered away from bringing Indian food for lunch. And then I also felt like I couldn't bring anything, like any food that like had any kind of smell, even if it wasn't like Indian food, because I didn't want that kind of attention again. Even if like my white peers were doing that, like it didn't feel like I could do that.
Yeah, I can also relate to that, being Indian American. Like, I think with Indian people, there's this like racist idea that, oh, we're stinky, so like our stinkiness comes from our lunch. So I would also like try to avoid bringing Indian food when I was younger to like school, and just like try to eat what's considered American or white.
Yeah, I think from elementary school, I always look forward to Wednesday because that was pizza day, and I didn't have to worry about what I was going to bring. I was just going to get 2 slices, be happy, fit in, and it would be a great day. But I think over time, like throughout middle school, I learned to kind of not push it aside, but be more embracing of who I am, the food that I eat, the food that I enjoy eating. And it brought out another part of me that ventured further into this pushing, that now I'm not really affected by it anymore. I bring what I want to school, I eat what I want, and it's very liberating, but it starts with small moments like that.
When I was in middle school, a teacher mockingly brought up K-pop in class, and people around me just started laughing and giggling. And I remember I was just so mortified, and I could not think straight. I was just frozen in my seat, and I was staring straight ahead. And I think what really upset me was the fact that I knew that even if a chance was given to me to stand up for myself and my culture, I wouldn't have done it because I was afraid that the belittling and the mockery was going to be directed towards me next and instead of my culture. And so I think I was just really disappointed that I couldn't even defend an entire half of my identity, my Korean identity and my Korean American identity.
I think adding on to that, especially in like elementary school when you're like really little and you would like just want to fit in, it was really difficult. So when I was younger, I'd bring in like there's always snack time, and I'd always have like these like really spicy Indian snacks that I loved, and I was like would have them all the time, and they're like my favorite thing ever. It's called Morkul, and I remember in elementary school, and everyone would ask like I didn't look any like your typical Cheetos or anything. They'd always be like, "What's that? That looks nasty," and it'd be so disheartening because it was something that like brought me so much joy, and then everyone would just not like completely disregard it and come to all these like different like conclusions when they hadn't even tried it. So I think also like the visual appeal of like Asian food being different is definitely disheartening at a younger age. But I feel like in high school now, people like I've come and like even in my environment, people are like more willing to try new things, which has been really nice to see.
Oh yeah, I definitely like very much agree with that. Like especially in elementary school, I don't know why specifically in elementary school, but like it would always like be these little moments of like when people would look at like my thermos and see what's inside, they would be like, "Oh, that's gross. That looks like vomit," or like just like these small little things that I would kind of like brush off and be like, "Oh, they just don't like it. That's fine." But like I think like, and I also agree with you that it was disheartening because like I loved those foods, and people like when I would bring it to school, they would think it's disgusting. It's like, well, does that mean I'm eating disgusting food and love it? Like they kind of like, like put me in this like perpetual spot of whether or not like I really actually love these foods, or like it's my culture. So like it just made me so confused. And then like now like you never like in high school and like at least for me like I never really see that anymore. And people are so much more willing to try new foods and like be educated, and like I at least try to like educate myself on different cultures' foods, and then I try to educate other people on like my culture's foods, and like try to stop those moments from happening, because like it really puts people down, and it's going against someone's culture, which isn't morally correct. So I mean like just trying to like educate people on both like your culture and like educating yourself on their culture, I think is really important, especially when you're older. And then like carrying that down to our kids, because if this is happening in elementary school, then like these types of situations can carry on into their adult.
Yeah, for me, there are a few incidences of lunchbox moments, but one that I remember standing out is I used to bring these chestnuts, I believe. I was so young that I didn't quite know what they were, and they came in this vacuum sealed pack, and I loved them, and one of my friends loved them, and our other white friend decided one day to say, "Oh, those look like squirrel brains," and those two words have really like stuck with me. I think those incidences have decreased, mostly because I just get school lunch now. I don't really know, but I do think that words like that really stick with people in a way that a lot of individuals are not aware of. So it's really good to teach your children and like educate your children on what food means in terms of people's cultural identity, because it does feel like a personal offense when someone says your food smells terrible, you smell terrible, or what you're eating, what you're really enjoying looks like squirrel brains. So just having that greater consciousness and awareness is really important.
Yeah, and I definitely think it's also been really interesting to see how perceptions of food have changed over time, where, for instance, like in elementary school, foods that people would look at and be like, you're like, what's that? Like, that's gross. And to see like 10 years down the line that those foods are now like popular. And especially I think nowadays there's a really big trend with Asian foods within like wellness spaces or such, of them being like trendy or being like these really cool like alternative foods that are now, it's now like cool to eat them. And it's definitely frustrating to see how like Asian cuisine has been so culturally appropriated, and like the same people who hated on the food that I ate before are now like making it their own thing, like, oh, like this is so cool, like why don't you try it? And it's just interesting to see how it wasn't okay when other people, when it wasn't like accepted by white mainstream media, but now that it is like, oh, now it's your thing and now it's your like trendy wellness thing, when all along it's been like Japanese food or Indian food, and that recognition just like disappears when the cultural appropriation happens.
I think for me, I never really actually had the lunchbox moment that a lot of people do have. And it was almost because I preempted that experience by not bringing food to school at all, because I saw that other people would get lunch from school or they would have American food. So I was like, I remember telling my parents, I was like, I don't want to bring any food because I don't want to seem weird. So I never really even had the negative experience to stop bringing those types of foods. It was just like almost immediately ingrained in me that I didn't want to have any type of cultural food or something that would make me stand out. So throughout elementary school and middle school, I always got school lunch, and I never really faced that type of discrimination. But I think for me, in terms of feeling ashamed of being Asian American, it all really culminated in middle school for me. And that was the period in my life where I really, really tried to distance myself from my Chinese identity. Like, I used to go to Chinese school and I used to do Chinese dance, and I quit all of those things after middle school because I was just somehow embarrassed by them. And it's kind of sad. It is sad because now I'm not as good at Mandarin as I used to be. I can not really speak it that well, which is sad because I used to be fluent in it, but I just stopped speaking it entirely. And something that's almost even worse is that I speak so much English at home that my parents have started speaking a lot more English in order to respond to me. But I think, especially in terms of Chinese dance, like I've always danced, and it was like, I think the first type of dance that I started out doing, but I ended up really, really hating it by the end because all the Chinese or cultural aspects of it, I could tell were seen as weird by other people, and no one outright told me those things, but it was just like the societal like pressure to be American or to fit in that really made me hate those types of things that were clearly Asian to me. So in middle school, I really tried to distance myself from those types of things, and I like didn't really talk about doing those things because I like immediately would feel embarrassed about it. And now thinking back to it, I'm like really upset that I quit those things at that point in my life, because I know if I still did them now, I would really, really enjoy them. And, you know, maybe I'll go back to doing it in the future. But I feel like that's something that really like stood out to me, was that in middle school, I really just felt like that alienation from wanting to be Chinese.
I think connecting to Emily's point, I never really experienced that lunchbox moment. I'm transracial, so my mother's white, so she sent me to school, like elementary school. And I think I realized at that point that I was different from other Asian American kids in my class because I never brought the same snacks as them. And in a way, I thought I wasn't as Chinese American or Asian American as my classmates because I wasn't eating the same foods. And I think that in some ways made me question my identity, but not in a bad way, not in a negative way. I think it just helped me open up and explore who I really was. But the one hurtful thing that happened throughout, I think, elementary, middle school, I think maybe someone else here has experienced it, where the foods that you eat are questioned, or like, I guess for me, the lack of food that I ate, in the sense that I didn't bring like Asian food, I didn't bring Chinese Asian food. And I wouldn't know how to answer that because I didn't eat it, and I didn't eat it at home. And it was really confusing as like a third grader being asked, where's your supposedly like your food? So I think that's kind of caused me throughout my development to question my identity more and kind of wonder, am I more American while I should be more Chinese? So that's kind of the experience I've had.
I just wanted to add on to like Eureka's point from earlier about like Asian foods becoming like trendy by like white media and like white masses. It's just like, it's very frustrating that like in order for like an Asian food to be like accepted by mainstream media or like just like mainstream American society, it like needs white validation. Like earlier, like recently I saw a commercial of like a tikka masala, and this commercial only featured like white people and white families using it. So like seeing that from being South Asian was just like really upsetting, because it felt like I had to like these cultural foods needed to be like the Asianness from it needed to be erased in order to be like seen as like accepted.
Adding on to what Emily and I forget your name, Juliana, yeah, what you guys have both said, whereas lack of food or like a disheartening of like your own food, there's no way to like please this like this society that or like this impression, like there's no way, and it's really hard for like I as a young child like to like deal with this, like there's no right answer, because either way you're going to get so much pushback, and it's definitely something that when you're older it opens up a gateway for you to like grow, but as a young kid it's really difficult to like think about like, if I don't do this then I'll get this reaction, but if I do this then I'll get this other reaction. So there's no like correct way, or not correct, but there's no way to like please society.
I want to take it back to what I said earlier and my experience in elementary school. When I brought spinach, turkey, and rice, which was my favorite food and still continues to be to this day, there were a lot of adverse reactions, looks, kids moving away, whatnot. And when I asked my mom to stop packing it, or whatever awesome food she was packing, I felt a little bit of guilt, because there's so much love and care and tenderness that's put into every meal that we're given, especially when we're not making it ourselves. And then to just diss it like that, there was a part of me that like, I could feel something, but I didn't know what it was. And so now that I'm looking back, it doesn't just affect the kid, right? There were pained expressions that my mother and father would give me when they sent me off with Cape Cod chips and sandwiches, but I didn't see those when I was taking my spinach, turkey, and rice, my curry, whatever it happened to be. So I think that when we're thinking about how it affects the grand scheme of things, it's not just the kid, although it mostly is, but it also affects the adults. It also affects just anyone that they're connected with.
And like adding on to what everyone's been saying, it's really hard to like let these things go, because like people have said, like in the high school setting you don't see that, like you see it rarely if at all. But like for me, during middle school, like 7th and 8th grade, I just like stopped bringing lunch because I didn't want to like run the risk of any of those things happening. And like to this day I know it wouldn't happen, but I just still don't bring lunch, because like it's almost like a habit now. Like I don't, maybe it's because I don't want to wake up early and make lunch, or maybe it's because like it's still like this thing that I feel like I know in my brain it won't happen, but like it's been so long that it just kind of sticks with you.
Yeah, and I can definitely relate to that experience of feeling that like unease and that anxiety about like, oh, what are people going to judge of me? Because when people judge food, people think, oh, it's just food. But like when food is such a big part of your culture, which is a big part of your identity, you're really judging the person and like their existence, which is definitely really painful. And something that Rialto brought up about like the parent part that really got me thinking was, so I didn't go to elementary school in Newton. I lived in Brookline, and I went to an elementary school that actually had like a fairly large Japanese population, because there was a Japanese ELL program, so it was almost like a magnet school in a sense. And I remember, like, my mother would make me traditional Japanese lunches and send me to school in them with like bento boxes and such. And I would get weird looks from like the non-Asian students of like, oh, like, why aren't you bringing your mac and cheese? Like, it's Tuesday, like, isn't Monday night like mac and cheese day? And so there was that tension there. But I also got, I actually completely forgot this, but my mom told me about this when I was older. Apparently when I was younger, like when I went to lunch, one of the Japanese kids was like, oh, like, why you're eating the same things that you were yesterday? Like, your mom doesn't cook you new food every single day. And for context, my mom, a lot of the Japanese mothers at my school were stay-at-home mothers. My mom worked full time, and there's this very high standard and pressure within the Japanese community and potentially other Asian communities as well, that like your ability to prepare lunch is like a reflection of your parenting. And that if you aren't able to produce these like immaculate like new lunches every day, then like you don't care about your children. And I remember coming home and telling my mom like, hey, like, why do I have the same thing as yesterday? Like, my friend told me that like that's because you don't care about me. And I remember, and like that, I completely forgot about that moment, but when she told me later, it really hit home for me and like made me realize like when people judge food in that sense, like it's not just about the food, and it really, the impact extends beyond them. And now looking back, like I do realize just how, almost like how hard it was for my mother as well, growing up, getting the criticism that either her food was weird or that she wasn't being like a good enough parent. And so it's just interesting to see how like that little comment that some kindergartner said like really impacted my family.
Very powerful comments and inspirational stories. As we transition to the next question, I would like to say the Google form for questions is down below the YouTube live stream description. So for our student panelists, so people can ask questions and everything. So then on to our next question. So in the past 2 years, there has been a rise in anti-AAPI hate crimes. How has this impacted you, and how do you understand your identity?
So for me personally, being someone who isn't regarded as the stereotypical Asian or kind of what you see as Asian, I am fairly white passing. Like my skin is pretty pale. So I personally did not really get affected by like the beginning of the pandemic, like early like 2020 and like moving forward. But I think it really was the start of like me kind of like going more in depth of like why this was happening, because I was seeing so many of these hate crimes going on social media, and like with Atlanta happening and all of these different assault and shooting cases and killing cases happening, it really made me like want to kind of understand like where this was coming from and what the community was going through. And then through that, it kind of made me realize my own identity and what Asian really meant, and what like kind of AAPI really meant, and who was and kind of like what was considered AAPI and Asian. So I think it was really like eye-opening for me to kind of figure out my own identity, and also to like really kind of understand where all of this was coming from, and like just educate myself on and just learn more about the AAPI community and being Asian American and what it really means to be Asian American, and all of the I guess like situations and things that come with being Asian American. So yeah.
Okay, yeah. So as Chinese American, the pandemic affected me a lot, specifically at North. In March 2020, I think right before we went into quarantine, I think we all kind of knew we were gonna go into quarantine for a few weeks. We knew that the pandemic was happening. Cases were increasing a ton. And I was walking with one of my friends who's also Chinese American down the hallway after lunch next to the engineering and the drafting room. And we were walking, we were talking, and we hear two people cough at us. And it's an unfortunate event, and we kind of turned around and we were like, did they just cough at us? Because we had seen, and I think at least I kind of was like expecting a rise in Asian hate, especially anti-Chinese sentiments. And I was like, they just coughed at us. And I hadn't even like realized that it could happen here in Newton, because I feel like we live in a bubble here with many like liberal sentiments, many people who support Black Lives Matters, protect Asian lives. So it was kind of just like, wow, I didn't realize this could happen to me, specifically me, or anyone else who's identifies as Asian American or Chinese American at this school. So I think that sort of told me I was unsafe at this school in some ways, and I had to be way more protective of my identity and who I was.
I think for me, the pandemic was the first time where I really felt super tied down to being Asian American, because throughout middle school and up until my sophomore year, which is when we went into lockdown, I had still kind of been trying to run away from being Chinese and being recognized as Chinese American or Asian American. Like, I knew people saw me and were like, oh, she's Asian, and whatever associations they made with that. And I had seen, obviously, a decent amount of stereotypes and some hate, but it never really impacted me personally. But once the pandemic hit, it really made me realize that when people look at me, that's a lot of the time the first thing they see. And then, especially during that time, people would look at me and they're like, oh, she's Asian. Most of the time they would assume I'm Chinese, which I do happen to be. But then I realized that there wasn't any way I could really escape that part of my identity, which for me at that point in my life was very, very scary, because I still hadn't fully accepted being Asian American, and I wasn't proud of being Asian American necessarily. So being tied to those negative connotations of COVID coming from China and that type of thing really, really like put the nail in the coffin for me. And I think also with just the rise of Asian American hate, it really, I think the time it almost had the biggest impact on me was when my parents like had to talk to me, and they were like, you have to watch out for yourself, because throughout my entire life I never really was scared for my safety, especially living in Newton. And like at that point I like still, like if I went out on a walk or something by myself at that point, because there wasn't really that much we could do, my parents were like, why would you like leave the house? It's like dangerous to go out. And I like at that point it still hadn't like made sense to me that like it would actually be dangerous for me to go out on the street or like go out and do things. And then just with the increasing number of hate crimes, it was just something that really scared me. And it's still something that my parents tell me all the time. And next year I'm going to college in New York, and I've had so many people tell me, like, are you sure you want to go? Like, it's really, really dangerous. And I think that's just something that is really scary, because it never really was that big of a thing until the pandemic.
Yeah, I actually wanted to apply to a school early in New York, and my mom wouldn't let me. She was like, "You're gonna get hurt if you go to New York City. There's no saving you there." But also touching back on what you brought up and what Juliana also brought up, this idea of a suburban Newton bubble, I feel like has been really popped and really penetrated by this surge in COVID hate crimes. At least bringing this back to something that actually happened in the Newton public schools. It was a year to go. Time's weird with the pandemic, but there was an attack. Someone got the Zoom login for an AP Chinese class at Newton South, and if I remember clearly, there were a few racial slurs thrown at the predominantly Asian Chinese American class. And so this fear that Emily, Juliana, everyone here is like expressing is so incredibly real and so incredibly present. And it penetrates this like liberal sheen of Newton. And I just want to bring that up because frankly, I haven't heard much conversation about that cyber attack, I guess I'll call it, that intrusion since. And I think it's really important to remember instances like this and remember that spaces like affinity groups, spaces like this panel and this cultural day are really important for creating some sense of safety and opening communication between different communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely relate to that sensation. I think the two things that came up to my mind first were one, throughout the pandemic, and I mean, even to this day, I feel like I've only started more recently being aware of the fact, but I've always felt that, like, as an Asian person and as someone who especially looks East Asian, and to a lot of non-Asian people, like, people will assume I'm Chinese because that's the first thing that people think of when they think of East Asian. I've noticed that, like, from the beginning of the pandemic, I felt a sense that I need to be, like, even more careful about how I behave and how I take COVID measures, because if I'm not being hyper vigilant, then, like, I will be perceived as, like, someone who's spreading the virus or someone who's, like, causing all of this, which is a completely, like, irrational belief, but I've noticed that's definitely influenced the way that I've approached, like, and navigated through the pandemic, where I felt, like, uncomfortable about, like, being in situations or, like, doing things that are not, like, the most hypervigilant things you can do, out of fear of, like, people judging me in a sense of, like, oh, well, that means you must not care, like, that means you want to spread the virus to other people. And after talking to, like, some other friends that I've had, I've noticed the same thing, where they feel like they need to be extra, like, they need to prove themselves in the sense that they need to show that they're, like, American and that they're not some viral vector, which is ridiculous. But it's definitely something I've noticed, especially now recently as COVID restrictions are starting to ease. And then also, second, I think the moment that really made me think about this a lot was the Atlanta spa killings last year. And when the news came out and I was reading about the victims and going through the descriptions, it started to really hit me. So it's like, okay, the targets were middle-aged Asian American women, like my mother. Like, my mother works in Chinatown, and again, like, nobody cares that she's Japanese. Like, I mean, the perpetrator of the Atlanta spa killings didn't care about those women. Like, they only cared about the fact that they were Asian women that they wanted to murder. And I think when that clicked for me, that it, like, really hit home of, okay, like, this is something that is impacting me, like, even though I am not Chinese. And also just realizing how like, people I love can be targeted because of the way that they look. And I think that's when it, like, really hit home for me, besides the fact of just being Asian, of realizing, like, my mother fit that exact narrative and, like, worked in a location where, like, she was more likely to be targeted because it was such a predominantly Asian area.
Yeah, I think you took the words right out of my mouth. I think that not only was that the moment that really struck me, it was another shock of remembering the importance of appearance. And now that we're wearing masks, if you're out in public, someone doesn't know you, doesn't know what they look like, they can only see this much. And then they're still going to make that same judgment, that same first impression of, okay, that's what that is, that's who that person is. And then it's really hard to change that unless you have a conversation with them, right? And so in this time of reflection, I realized, wait, there's that question of what are you that I've experienced multiple times, because it's not really clear when you look at me. And unless I have that conversation, people don't know. And so then I thought about my family members and how we each look a little bit different and how each of them could potentially be perceived and the ramifications of those perceptions, and realized how serious this really was, how cognizant I had to be of the actual danger that has, as Rose said, penetrated this bubble, and how to make sure that my siblings understood that there was this danger as well, and they weren't overlooking it as I had previously been.
Yeah, and I think like being not like East Asian, but being AAPI, still like needing to be educated and helping the AAPI community, even though I'm not East Asian and the target of these attacks, gives me an even bigger reason to, educate myself and help other fellow AAPI, people who are being targeted, because it's the AAPI community and it's a part of the AAPI community that's being attacked. And even though I'm not on the receiving end of those attacks, it does not make me any less eligible to, help and inform other people and to stand up for others in the AAPI community that are being attacked and being targeted by these people that are putting all of these sentiments and stereotypes against East and Southeast Asians. So yeah, I think as someone who is West Asian and even not even just part of the AAPI community, everybody should be needing to educate themselves and trying to stop these attacks, because this isn't just one group of people's problems. This is a world problem, and everybody should be trying to stop these little, or not even little, but just all of these micro and macro aggressions. And yeah, I think it's really been a moment in history where people have started to come together, and all of these big issues have started to come to light, and really you see people banding together and stopping all of these hate crimes. So yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And as someone who's not East Asian, therefore isn't directly affected by these, I think a lot of what these things have helped me realize or have made me think about is just how I'm perceived, because I'm mixed race, so I don't really I have no objective idea of what people think of when they see me. But my mom is fully Indian, my dad is half black, half white. And so then in 2020 there was a spike in hate for a lot of different groups. And so then I started thinking about how he's perceived, how my little sister's perceived, how I'm perceived. And it's just it's very confusing, and it's something that I really struggled with, because to this day I have no idea, because I can't look at myself through other people's eyes. But I think it's definitely made me think about that a lot.
I think during COVID was when I first experienced hate directly towards me and not my culture, because when my mom and I went to Star Market and we were waiting in line when COVID first started. Star Market had us line up outside the store, so not too many people would crowd inside the store. And I was just standing in line, and this elderly white woman was behind us. And when we turned around, just to look at how long the line had gotten, she intentionally backed off from us, and we weren't really doing anything, and we were distancing ourselves and everything, but she still ended up just backing out. And that just really hit home how much Asian hate has gotten prevalent, even in Newton, where we don't usually think that there's a lot of hate, racially motivated hate or anything. And I think that's when I realized that I need to be comfortable in my skin in order to change anything, because at times like COVID, I feel people like me or Asian Americans need to be comfortable with their Asian American identity to change anything else. Because if we don't feel comfortable, others are going to convince us, the society is going to convince us otherwise, that our culture is dirty, it's inferior to the white culture and American culture. And I think that's when I really started realizing that I need to get a strong tie to my Asian heritage and culture in order to make anything better.
Yeah, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the intersectionality, the weird intersectionality of all these hate crimes. A lot of the time, most of the time, in the cases of the Atlanta spa shootings, definitely, it's Asian women who are attacked, Asian grandmothers who are pushed over in city streets. And I'd just like to speak on that a little bit. Of course, hatred anywhere, like as Luke was saying, impacts all of us, impacts all genders, impacts all ethnic backgrounds. But I think it's really important to acknowledge the unique things that go into discrimination and hate towards Asian women. There's, specifically with the Atlanta spa shooter, he had basically a fetish. He had an Asian fetish, and that was why he felt the need to eliminate Asian women to get rid of that temptation. And there's this violence and imperialism, colonialism are all tied up inside this hate that is pushed down upon Asian women. And I just wanted to talk about that a little bit to get that intersectional aspect in.
All right. Very inspirational stories. A positive question you guys will have fun on. What is something that you celebrate about being Asian American?
Personally, for me, in my culture of like being Indian, and both my parents are Indian, like I have a pretty straightforward like ethnicity and family tree. And one thing that I really love specifically is going to the weddings, and I just feel like it's very different than like your stereotypical like American wedding where it's like white and black, and it's like very like it feels very like straightforward. But specifically at Indian weddings, it's always like just a bunch load of color, and it's just completely wild. And it's like 5 days of like the funnest times of your life, and it's just so wild and fun and chaotic. And that's just one thing that I really love, is that how much like color and like explosion of like sensory details, like the sound, the colors, like the visual aspect, the like smells, and it's wild. So that's just one thing that I really love.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I feel like weddings and just like any type of like cultural family gathering where you're like celebrating culture is, I think, where I'm the most tied to in, like my Armenian culture. And as Izzy was saying, like, like being like a pretty straightforward, like my ethnicity is like 100% this, like I even have like, an ancestry test that says like I'm 99.9% Armenian, which is I think kind of like funny to me because I was like, oh, I'm just this one thing just in total. So that was kind of fun to see. But like definitely at weddings, like it's just people like dancing around, and it's like really the only time I get to listen to like Armenian music and just kind of like get to sit there and like really embrace our like culture and just how fun it is, and just like how everybody just comes together, even if you don't like even if I don't know like my own extended family that well. Like there's one thing that really brings us together, and that's just our culture and the different values we have that are like that come from our culture, and just how we can connect through music and like the food that we eat, and just like the one connection that we have, which is like being Armenian, or being like just being your culture. I think that's really important to me, and I think it's where I just feel the most connected, is where like the culture is really prevalent in food and music and just the people around you.
Yeah, and like adding on to both of you, I was going to say weddings too, because I feel like they're a combination of like my favorite parts, like the food, like the huge family, and the clothes. Because like, so my mom's dad has like 10 siblings, so I have a ton of like cousins and aunts and uncles that I don't see that much, but it's like really fun to be able to just like have all of us in one place. And then like the clothes are like beautiful, and everything is like hand sewn and very like intricate designs. And then the food and the music and like the lights and the decorations are just like really, really fun to be around. And like for our family, like since my mom has like a ton of cousins because her dad has so many siblings, and they always do like, they choreograph a dance and like do it like for the bride and groom, whoever it happens to be. So yeah.
I think I really enjoy just like speaking and learning like my language, Korean, because I realized that there's a lot of like it's Korean and English is really different, and the words each language have are really different. So like a lot of the times when I'm watching, like when I see my friends, or like when I'm watching like a Korean show, or like Squid Game even, which was really popular, like I see the English subtitles and I'm like, that is not what they're saying. Because like there's so many like words in Korean that English doesn't have, or like sometimes vice versa, but mostly there's a lot of words in Korean that English doesn't have. And so just like trying to learn more about my language and just like speaking it, and I think that's like something I enjoy about my culture. And also just being able to speak a language that other people don't really understand, so in public I can like speak privately with my family. I think that's something I really enjoy and celebrate about my culture.
I think my favorite part about my culture is my Filipino school that I go to, and the community, the friends that I've made there, the adults that are ready to support you in however they can, and then just the freeness with which I'm able to express myself, not worried about being judged. Well, I'll just laugh it off and move on. And then beyond that, the gatherings that we have with those same people and the bonds that we forge are they're of a different, cut from a different cloth, I would say. And I think that there's this authenticity that goes beyond just between you and me, and food, being late, which is called Filipino time, and like just enjoying each other's presence without a care in the world is something that I feel like we rarely get. And I think I've missed that, especially over COVID, not being able to see family and friends as much. So I want to get as much of that as I can before I go off to college. And I value my time with them so much.
Yeah, as someone who's gone to Japanese school for 14 years now, and like I'm actually graduating in a few weeks, which is wild to think of. That's definitely been a really big part of my identity, especially given both of my parents immigrated here and all of my family lives in Japan. And so I've had very little interaction with like cousins or grandparents. And so for me, I've really found my sense of family and culture through the Japanese community within Greater Boston. And I can really resonate with the notion that you're talking about, Rialto, where you can just, I feel like I can go in and just be myself in a way that I can't in other spaces. And it's been hard with COVID not being able to see people in person, but I remember I was able to meet up with a couple of Japanese friends over the summer, and we hadn't seen each other in person for years. But like the moment we were together, like it was just as if like nothing had changed. And I think that connection that we felt is something that is really understated, but is really powerful. And especially surrounding like cultural events, like today is actually Girls' Day in Japan. And so like having those celebrations and with the food and the music and just being together is a really incredible feeling that I think is one thing that makes me really proud of being AAPI.
Yeah, for me, I'm just going to share something. It's a little bit similar to what Sean was saying, but as a multiracial person who's sort of vaguely ethnically ambiguous, I can speak fairly okay Mandarin. I wouldn't say fluent, but I can definitely understand day-to-day language. I can just listen into conversations. I can like spy on people. I remember when I was younger, I used to think of it as a superpower. I had this special, unique ability, and I could just blend in anywhere, and I could listen to any conversation and surprise people. I've had a few instances where people were talking smack about me and Mandarin, and then I turn around and just say something to them. So for me, that's a funny little anecdote. But on a more serious note, for me, celebrating my Asian American identity has a lot to do with my mother and my grandparents who are in Beijing. So it's been sort of difficult to like gather together and do traditional things that we would normally do. I haven't seen them in probably like 4 years because of COVID. But yeah, there are a lot of things you can celebrate about Asian American, Asian identities. And yeah.
Yeah, I think as a transracial adoptee, I have a lot very different experience than you guys, because I don't automatically just celebrate all of the cultural Chinese celebrations or festivals. So one way that I take pride in my identity is being able to help my younger sister, who's in 5th grade and is also not adoptee, learn about her culture and the festivals or celebrations that are celebrated in China that we may not follow, but we do happen and is a part of our identity as we are Chinese American. So being able to explain those to her and teach her small words in Chinese is definitely something that makes me feel more proud to be Chinese, because I'm able to share it with someone who's alike me, and I guess someone who comes from like the same background and will eventually have the same experience.
Something that I really enjoy, it's a very small, maybe almost nuanced thing, is when I go and I hang out with my friend who happens to be Chinese, and I walk into their house and I can immediately tell that their family is Chinese, just like not even like big things, but like small little decorations or certain placements of furniture, and I can tell that it's a Chinese household. And I feel like it's always really funny when I walk in, I'm like, oh, this is totally a Chinese person's house. And then when I pillage through their food, I'm like, oh, I have all of these things in my own kitchen. And or like, I'll see a brand of a certain thing that my parents always buy, and I'm like, oh my God, we have the exact same thing. And I think just finding those similarities between me and my other Chinese American friends is really cool, because when I walk into my friends' houses that are like white or of different cultures, I always feel a little bit awkward, because obviously there are different like customs, or like how, like if you take your shoes off at the door, if they don't care, and it's always like, I don't know step in the house. But when it's someone Chinese's house, I'm like, oh, I know what I have to do, and it feels very natural to me, and I think that's something that I really enjoy, and it's just like not as awkward. And then we can also
that like isn't Armenian. Most of my friends are not Armenian. When I walk into their houses, I'm just really awkward because I have no idea what to do. But the thing is, like, if I walk into any Armenian household, even if it's like I'm there for the first time or not, like I know exactly like where everything is, like what I can do with myself in the house, like what I know I can and cannot touch. And then also like kind of going back to what Sean was saying and what Rose was saying, like I grew up in like a multilingual household. And so even though like nowadays like I can't speak Armenian at all, like I'm grateful for the fact that I can still like pretty fluently understand. So like when Rose was talking about like when people will have conversations behind your back and you can kind of just like sit there and listen and like eavesdrop, it's kind of like a superpower. Especially when I was younger, I would be like, I know exactly what they're saying. Or like even like noticing like Armenian people in public, it really made me happy because it's like, oh my God, like I understand like my own language. So it really made me happy, and just like kind of growing up like speaking a mix of like Armenian and English, and like me not knowing the word for shopping cart for 10 years, and always saying the Armenian word because I was clueless, and I was out shopping with friends once, and that's where I finally figured out that shopping cart was shopping cart. Or like even with like the word milk for like 5 years. So I think like looking back on those moments and like kind of laughing and seeing like how much of my culture was really like embedded into myself and my life was, I think, really joyous to see.
Okay. A bit tight on time, but last question actually. What is something that you want people to understand about being Asian American?
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
You can go.
Okay. What I was gonna say was just that like the umbrella of AAPI is just so big, and I feel like a lot of people mostly consider East Asians when people say Asian, but it's like it's a huge continent, and there's like a lot of people that maybe aren't initially considered when you think of Asian people. So just like being conscious of the fact that there are many different groups under the umbrella of AAPI.
I think I just wanted to say that there's so many silenced Asian hate, and what I mean by that is basically a crime is racially motivated until it comes to Asian Americans. When it comes to Asian Americans, a crime doesn't have a pattern. It's random, it's coincidental, and a lot of the times the evidence presented speaks otherwise. And I would just like to say, like, do your own research, because one resource is not going to do you any justice. And if you look at different media or sources, then you can fact check between those sources as well and form your own opinions. So I would just say, like, don't trust one source. And also, like, if society has given us these many troubles and made us feel like our culture is inferior, I think the least it can do is listen to us when we speak out. And if we say that there's a problem, and if we are speaking up for our rights, and if we say that we do feel pain about the Asian hate crimes, then the least society can do is listen. And listening and acknowledging is basically the first step to solving the problem. So I would just like to say, just like listen when we say something.
I guess to piggyback off of that, I think one thing that I really want people to take away is like, and Ms. Leong actually mentioned this during the A-Block panel, but like don't forget AAPI folks and social justice movements. So often I feel like AAPI folks are like conveniently left out of the equation or like left out of conversations surrounding social justice because, oh, we're too white to be people of color, but we're not white enough to be treated as human beings. And I think just remembering that like AAPI folks have a very long history of engaging in social justice. And while the model minority myth says that we're obedient people who don't rock the boat with anything, like that's not the case, and we are people. And I think just remembering that, and also like Maya was saying, remembering that AAPI is such a wide umbrella, and you're never going to meet two AAPI folks who are the same or who are even like similar in a sense. And so just remembering that when you're talking about AAPI folks, like there's a huge diversity there, and no one thing is going to like apply to everyone.
Yeah, just to echo what everyone else has been saying, if you want to be intersectional with your activism, you need to include us, AAPI people, in your activism. Like, I think because of like the model minority myth and like this perception of like Eureka was saying, of like Asians being white, people think we don't experience racism, but as we can see with like the pandemic and hate crimes, that isn't the case. But even then, it shouldn't take hate crimes for other people to recognize that we're being oppressed.
I think it's important, at least for me and in my experience, to be true to yourself and be true to your feelings. And it's taken me a long time to get to that point, especially with the model minority myth, where you're expected to figure it out and succeed without much help. That's not healthy. And I've kind of learned that the hard way. And so as long as you're able to acknowledge and be aware that you're struggling and you're able to ask for help, that's the greatest sign of strength that you can show.
I think one small point, but very important point that Ms. Leong was talking about earlier today was that when AAPI speak out about their problems or the obstacles they face, it's not us trying to belittle other socioeconomic problems or other causes that people are fighting. This is not the oppression Olympics. Races, no matter what kind of racism is, no matter what kind of oppression it is, it's all the same. It's all one big fight. While multifaceted, it's one big fight that we all have to think about and process as like BIPOC and just as a community together.
Just adding on to what Tia was saying earlier, I think one main thing that I want to bring attention to is that positive stereotypes are not inherently positive, and that they are still stereotypes, and that they still are discrimination and have bad effects on people, because, oh, being told you're like automatically smart or automatically good at math does not mean that that is a good thing. And oftentimes, I think almost all the time, it actually has a negative impact. And a lot of the impact that it has is that it like undermines work that we do to achieve to a level that we do achieve to, and it also undermines AAPI mental health, which I think is something that really just isn't talked about very often, and something that really needs to be brought to attention. And I think those types of issues are something that we need to recognize as a society and work towards addressing.
Thank you all so much.
It was really powerful to hear all your experiences. And that is the end of our questions. Sorry we didn't have time for a Q&A. Thank you all for joining us today during our last block of Asian American Culture Day. We hope that the experiences of these students will help anyone who's struggling with accepting their identities and expanding their perspectives. We look forward to seeing you all during Asian American Culture Night on March 26th. Sign-ups for performances close tomorrow at midnight. If you're interested in joining Asian American Culture Club, we meet Tuesdays during Tiger Block. Please reach out to any of us officers through social media or email if you're interested in joining and learning more about Asian American culture and identity. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks, y'all.
Bro, the whole time I was like, oh my god, what
Are
if
we
I
good?
drop this? Well,